In just 50 years, Viking raiders destroyed over 200 English monasteries, killed thousands of monks, and stole church treasures worth more than entire kingdoms. But the Vikings didn't just take gold and silver. They systematically dismantled the very foundation of Christian civilization in England, turning houses of God into scenes of unimaginable sacrilege that shocked even hardened medieval warriors. This is the untold story of the Viking monastery raids. Not just random acts of violence, but a calculated campaign that targeted the very heart of medieval European civilization. From the first shock of Lindisfarne to the systematic destruction that followed, we'll explore how Viking raiders transformed England's sacred spaces into scenes of horror that traumatized an entire continent. To understand the shock of Viking monastery raids, we must first grasp what these institutions meant to medieval Europe. Monasteries weren't just religious centers, they were libraries, schools, hospitals, and repositories of Western civilization's accumulated knowledge. They housed irreplaceable manuscripts, trained scholars, and preserved the learning of the classical world. English monasteries accumulated enormous wealth through royal donations and pilgrimage offerings. Golden chalices, jeweled crosses, silver altar vessels, and gospel books bound in precious metals filled their treasuries. For Viking raiders, these concentrations of portable wealth represented irresistible targets, riches beyond imagination stored in institutions defended only by prayer. June 8, 793 AD. The monastery of Lindisfarne, cradle of English Christianity, fell to Viking raiders in a single day. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the horror. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. The Christian world had never witnessed such deliberate sacrilege. The Vikings understood that attacking monasteries was more than robbery, it was psychological warfare against Christian faith itself. By desecrating the most sacred spaces in England, they weren't just stealing treasure, they were proving that the Christian God couldn't protect his own priests and holy places from pagan raiders. After Lindisfarne's success, Viking raids on monasteries became systematic. Rathlin, Iona, Inishmurray, each raid refined their techniques. They learned which monasteries held the greatest treasures, when monks were most vulnerable, and how to extract maximum wealth with minimal resistance. This wasn't mindless violence, it was organized religious warfare. Monasteries were perfect targets for Viking raiders. Built on isolated islands or remote coastlines for spiritual contemplation, they were accessible by sea but far from military assistance. Their inhabitants were vowed to peace, often elderly or scholarly rather than warrior-trained. Most importantly, they contained concentrated wealth with minimal defenses. Viking monastery raids followed predictable patterns. They struck at dawn when monks were at morning prayers, trapped in their chapel with few escape routes. Raiders separated the wealthy from the poor, tortured monks to reveal hidden treasures, and systematically searched every building for valuable items before departing with the tide. Vikings knew exactly what to look for in monastery treasuries. Gospel books with jeweled covers, golden chalices, silver patens, reliquaries containing saints' bones, and ecclesiastical vestments woven with gold thread. They ignored parchment and focused on precious metals, creating a fortune in portable wealth from each successful raid. What horrified medieval chroniclers most wasn't the theft of gold, but the destruction of irreplaceable manuscripts. Vikings tore apart illuminated gospels to extract their jeweled covers, using priceless vellum pages as tinder for fires. Centuries of accumulated knowledge went up in smoke for momentary warmth or casual vandalism. Beyond theft, Vikings deliberately desecrated sacred objects in ways calculated to horrify Christians. They broke holy relics, used altar stones as anvils for reshaping stolen silver, and reportedly used consecrated wine as common drink. These acts of sacrilege were designed to prove the powerlessness of the Christian God. Vikings quickly learned that living monks were worth more than dead ones. High-ranking abbots and scholarly monks could be ransomed back to their communities for substantial sums, while ordinary brothers might be sold into slavery. This economic approach to human capture made raids even more profitable than simple theft. English monasteries tried various defenses against Viking raids. Some moved their treasures inland, others hired guards, and a few attempted to buy protection through tribute payments. But these measures often failed because Vikings possessed superior mobility and could strike unpredictably across vast coastlines. English kings proved unable to protect their monasteries from Viking raids. Royal armies moved too slowly to intercept seaborne raiders who could strike and escape before defenders arrived. King Aethelred's armies often reached monasteries to find only smoking ruins and scattered manuscripts, arriving hours or days too late to help. The systematic robbery of English monasteries flooded Scandinavia with Christian gold and silver. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic increase in precious metal artifacts in Viking settlements during this period. English church treasures financed Viking expansion and funded larger expeditions to new targets. The loss of monastery libraries devastated English learning. Irreplaceable texts in Latin, Greek, and Old English disappeared forever. Medical knowledge, astronomical calculations, historical chronicles, and religious commentaries accumulated over centuries vanished in a few decades of systematic destruction. Captured monks became valuable commodities in Viking slave markets. Educated priests who could read and write commanded high prices in Ireland, Scandinavia, and beyond. Some monks spent years in bondage before being ransomed, while others never returned to their homeland, disappearing into the Viking world forever. Medieval chroniclers struggled to find words for Viking monastery attacks. Alcuin of York wrote of pagans desecrating God's sanctuary, while the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described raiders as wolves among sheep. These weren't just military defeats, they were spiritual crises that challenged medieval Christian worldview. Some English monasteries abandoned their coastal locations entirely. The monks of Lindisfarne fled inland to Chester-le-Street, carrying St. Cuthbert's relics to safety. Other communities disbanded completely, scattering their members to safer regions as Viking pressure made coastal religious life impossible. By the 850s, Viking raiders began overwintering in England, making monastery raids a year-round threat. The Great Army that arrived in 865 AD established permanent bases, allowing systematic exploitation of remaining monastic wealth. Seasonal raiding evolved into permanent occupation and continuous pressure. English monastery raids often connected to Viking bases in Ireland. Dublin served as a major slave market where captured English monks were sold alongside Irish prisoners. The interconnected nature of Viking operations across the Irish Sea made coordinated resistance extremely difficult for local authorities. Vikings often melted down stolen church treasures immediately after raids, destroying artistic masterpieces to create portable wealth. Exquisite religious artifacts that took master craftsmen years to create were reduced to raw silver within hours, erasing both monetary and cultural value forever. The Lindisfarne raid became the template for subsequent monastery attacks. Its success demonstrated that even the most sacred Christian sites were vulnerable to pagan raiders, encouraging additional expeditions and proving that enormous wealth could be extracted with minimal Viking casualties. Some monasteries developed innovative defenses against Viking raids. Round towers in Ireland provided secure refuges, while some English monasteries built fortified walls or relocated to inland hills. However, these adaptations fundamentally changed monastic life from peaceful contemplation to constant vigilance. Viking ransom demands often bankrupted religious communities. Monasteries sold land, borrowed money, and melted down remaining treasures to buy back captured abbots and monks. The economic drain of ransoms often proved more devastating than the original raids themselves. Some manuscripts survived Viking raids through heroic efforts by monks who hid precious books in walls, buried them in lead containers, or smuggled them to safety during attacks. The famous Book of Kells may owe its survival to such desperate preservation efforts during the Viking Age. News of English monastery destruction shocked Christian Europe. Continental monasteries began fortifying their own establishments and hiding treasures, fearing that Viking raiders might expand their targets beyond the British Isles. The English raids had created a new form of religious warfare. Archaeological excavations at destroyed monasteries reveal the systematic nature of Viking looting. Tool marks on altar stones show deliberate vandalism, while the absence of portable metal objects confirms thorough ransacking. Even nailheads were extracted from woodwork to claim every scrap of iron. The monastery raids created lasting trauma in English Christian consciousness. For generations afterward, the mere sight of ships on the horizon caused panic in coastal communities. The psychological wounds inflicted by Viking desecration of sacred spaces influenced English attitudes toward Scandinavians for centuries. Viking monastery raids in Ireland followed similar patterns, but faced different challenges. Irish monasteries were often associated with powerful clans who could provide military protection. However, the isolation of island monasteries like Skellig Michael made them just as vulnerable as their English counterparts. Viking ships gave raiders decisive advantages over monastery defenders. Shallow draft vessels could navigate rivers to reach inland targets, while superior sailing technology allowed quick escapes before military response could organize. Monastic isolation, chosen for spiritual reasons, became fatal vulnerability. Some English regions began paying tribute to Vikings specifically to protect their monasteries. This protection money, called danegeld, acknowledged that traditional military defense had failed. Paying raiders not to attack became preferable to losing irreplaceable religious treasures and human lives. Viking raids forced fundamental changes in English monastic life. Communities abandoned coastal locations, concentrated treasures in fewer, better defended sites, and began training monks in basic military skills. The contemplative ideal of defenseless holy men became untenable in the Viking Age. Learned monks fled England for continental Europe, taking their knowledge and skills to safer territories. This brain drain deprived England of intellectual leadership, while enriching Frankish and Germanic monasteries with English scholarship. The Viking raids inadvertently redistributed European learning. Monastery destruction weakened English royal authority. Kings who couldn't protect God's houses lost credibility with both clergy and nobility. This political vulnerability contributed to the fragmentation of English kingdoms and made subsequent Viking conquests easier to achieve. The destruction of English monastery art collections represents one of history's greatest cultural disasters. Illuminated manuscripts that took decades to create, metalwork by master craftsmen, and architectural innovations were lost forever. The artistic heritage of entire centuries disappeared in a few decades of raiding. Monasteries that survived developed sophisticated early warning systems. Coastal watchers, signal fires, and mounted messengers created networks to alert religious communities of approaching raiders. Some monasteries maintained hidden escape routes and predetermined evacuation procedures. Viking monastery raids created a theological crisis for English Christianity. How could a just God allow pagans to desecrate his holy places? Some interpreted the raids as divine punishment for Christian sins, while others questioned fundamental beliefs about divine protection and providence. Some English monasteries hired Viking mercenaries to protect them from other Viking raiders. This ironic solution involved paying one group of pagans to fight another, acknowledging that traditional Christian pacifism had become a luxury impossible to maintain in the new reality. Monastery raids particularly traumatized child oblates, young boys given to religious life by their families. These children, often from noble families, became valuable hostages or were sold into slavery. The targeting of innocent children intensified Christian horror at Viking tactics. Viking monastery raids followed predictable seasonal patterns. Spring raids targeted Easter treasures when churches displayed their finest artifacts. Summer expeditions could sustain longer campaigns, while autumn raids seized harvest tributes before winter storms made sailing dangerous. English monasteries began adopting new technologies for defense and treasure protection. Hidden chambers with secret entrances, underwater storage containers, and portable altar sets allowed rapid evacuation of valuables. Innovation, driven by necessity, replaced traditional trust in divine protection. English monastery raids became part of a broader Viking expansion across Europe. Techniques perfected in England were exported to Frankish territories, Iberian monasteries, and even Mediterranean religious sites. The English raids served as training grounds for larger continental campaigns. Some English kingdoms attempted to negotiate formal treaties with Viking raiders, offering annual payments in exchange for sparing monasteries. These agreements rarely lasted, as new Viking groups arrived who hadn't signed previous accords, making peaceful solutions nearly impossible. By the late 9th century, some English monasteries resembled military fortresses more than religious centers. High walls, armed guards, and strategic locations on defensible terrain transformed peaceful contemplative communities into militarized religious strongholds. Surviving English monasteries adapted their practices to Viking realities. Treasures were made portable for quick evacuation, important manuscripts were copied and distributed for safety, and religious ceremonies were modified to allow rapid interruption and escape. Monasteries that survived Viking raids often emerged financially stronger in the long term. Donations from grateful laypeople, royal grants for reconstruction, and careful treasure management sometimes resulted in greater wealth than before the raids occurred. Viking monastery raids profoundly influenced medieval literature. Chronicles, saints' lives, and epic poems incorporated themes of persecution, martyrdom, and divine justice. The raids became foundational stories that shaped English Christian identity for centuries. Archaeological evidence of Viking monastery raids continues to emerge from excavations across England. Burned layers, scattered artifacts, and hastily buried treasures tell the story of communities under siege. Each discovery adds details to our understanding of this traumatic period. Some monks became legendary for their resistance to Viking raiders. Stories of abbots who refused to reveal treasure locations under torture, monks who died protecting sacred relics, and communities that chose martyrdom over surrender inspired later generations of English Christians. For Vikings, monastery raids were practical rather than personal. These attacks represented efficient resource extraction from poorly defended wealthy targets. The religious significance that horrified Christians was largely irrelevant to raiders focused on economic gain and minimal casualties. Ironically, some Vikings who raided English monasteries later converted to Christianity. The very treasures they had stolen and the monks they had captured sometimes became instruments of their own conversion to the faith they had once attacked so brutally. Viking raids forced fundamental changes in English church organization. Centralized treasure storage, military alliances with secular rulers, and professional security arrangements replaced traditional reliance on divine protection and community isolation. Eventually, some English kingdoms achieved peaceful coexistence with Viking settlers through marriage alliances, trade agreements, and religious conversion. Former enemies became neighbors, though the trauma of the raid period continued to influence relationships for generations. Despite massive losses, some English monastic learning survived Viking raids through heroic preservation efforts. Hidden manuscripts, memorized texts, and scholars who fled to safety maintained threads of continuity that allowed later cultural recovery and renaissance. English monastery raids influenced defensive preparations across medieval Europe. Continental monasteries learned from English experiences, implementing security measures and treasure protection strategies before Viking raiders expanded their operations beyond British waters. The destruction of English monasteries had consequences lasting far beyond the Viking Age. Lost manuscripts meant gaps in historical knowledge, destroyed artistic traditions required centuries to rebuild, and the trauma influenced English attitudes toward foreigners for generations. Viking monastery raids evolved from opportunistic attacks to sophisticated military operations. Later expeditions involved multiple ships, coordinated timing, and intelligence gathering. The Great Army of 865 represented the culmination of tactics developed through decades of monastery raiding. When Vikings transitioned from raiding to settlement, their relationship with monasteries changed dramatically. Viking rulers who established permanent territories needed religious institutions for legitimacy and administration, transforming former enemies into essential partners. In areas of Viking settlement, Christianity and Norse traditions often blended in unexpected ways. Some churches incorporated Viking artistic motifs, while converted Vikings brought their own interpretations to Christian practices, creating unique hybrid religious expressions. The Viking monastery raids are among the best documented attacks in early medieval history. Multiple chronicles, archaeological evidence, and continental sources provide detailed accounts that allow historians to reconstruct events with unusual precision for the period. English monastic art eventually recovered from Viking destruction, often incorporating influences from the very cultures that had attacked them. The Winchester style of illumination showed Scandinavian influences, while Viking metalwork techniques appeared in later English religious artifacts. Viking monastery raids contributed to the eventual unification of England. The failure of individual kingdoms to protect their religious institutions demonstrated the need for stronger, more centralized authority capable of coordinating defense against external threats. The theft of English monastery treasures contributed to a fundamental shift in medieval economics. Precious metals that had been stored in religious institutions entered circulation through Viking trade, stimulating commercial activity across northern Europe. Viking monastery raids accelerated technological innovation in medieval Europe. The need for better defenses, communication systems, and treasure protection spurred developments in military engineering, cryptography, and architectural design that benefited society beyond the immediate security concerns. The monastery raids fundamentally altered English social structures. Traditional assumptions about divine protection, clerical immunity, and sanctuary rights collapsed under Viking pressure. New relationships between church and state, clergy and warriors emerged from the necessity of coordinated defense. Viking monastery raids prompted international cooperation among Christian kingdoms. Frankish, English, and Irish rulers began coordinating intelligence, sharing defensive strategies, and providing mutual assistance against the common pagan threat that transcended traditional political boundaries. The reconstruction of English monastic learning after Viking raids involved scholars from across Europe. Continental monasteries sent manuscripts, teachers, and resources to help rebuild what had been destroyed, creating new international networks of intellectual exchange. English monasteries developed innovative defensive techniques that influenced military architecture across medieval Europe. Hidden chambers, escape tunnels, movable treasures, and early warning systems became standard features copied by religious institutions throughout the continent. Recovery from Viking monastery raids required both physical reconstruction and psychological healing. New religious practices, modified liturgies, and therapeutic communities helped traumatized monks and lay people process their experiences and rebuild their faith. Viking monastery raids forced innovations in medieval law. New concepts of sanctuary violation, international crime, and collective defense emerged from legal scholars' attempts to categorize and respond to unprecedented forms of religious warfare. English response to Viking monastery raids included significant developments in naval technology and coastal defense. New ship designs, harbor fortifications, and maritime patrol systems emerged from the necessity of protecting vulnerable coastal religious communities. The trauma of Viking monastery raids became embedded in English cultural memory through stories, songs, and religious observances. Annual commemorations, martyrs' feast days, and historical chronicles preserved the memory of these attacks for centuries. Ironically, some English monks who survived Viking captivity later became missionaries to Scandinavia, converting their former captors to Christianity. The very people who had destroyed English monasteries eventually built new ones under the guidance of their former victims. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new details about Viking monastery raids. Advanced techniques like metal detection, ground-penetrating radar, and chemical analysis provide insights into destruction patterns, treasure-hiding techniques, and survival strategies. The Viking monastery raids established patterns of religious warfare that influenced European conflicts for centuries. The targeting of religious institutions, the systematic destruction of cultural treasures, and the use of sacred sites for psychological warfare became recurring themes. The eventual reconciliation between Vikings and English Christians required generations of careful diplomacy, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. Former enemies gradually became neighbors, business partners, and eventually fellow Christians, sharing common interests and values. The Viking monastery raids represent a pivotal moment in European history when pagan and Christian civilizations clashed directly. The outcome shaped the development of medieval European culture, politics, and religion in ways that influenced the continent for centuries. The Viking monastery raids that shocked medieval Europe were more than simple acts of piracy. They were a collision between two worlds that fundamentally transformed both. While the immediate destruction was horrific, the long-term consequences included technological innovation, international cooperation, and eventually the Christianization of Scandinavia itself. The monasteries that suffered so greatly under Viking raids ultimately played a crucial role in converting their attackers, proving that even the darkest chapters of history can lead to unexpected redemption.